Hi, this is Paul. As you can see and hear, I am back in Sacramento for a very short window. As I told you before, summer vacation was going to be a real big question mark in terms of output. I noticed that Cal Zeldin had put something on Twitter. Twitter with I had very limited internet connection for the last couple of weeks, which was actually kind of a blessing. I was up in the Canadian Rockies near Lake Louise and Moraine Lake and Emerald Lake and the ice fields, and it was absolutely glorious. And so I'm back. But whenever you get back from a couple of weeks gone, there's 100 little things that need attending to right away. And because I'm leaving, I've got to quickly get them all done. So I don't know how many videos I'll put out in these few days because I have another family trip that's coming up, and a trip to visit family. So I don't know how much videos will get made during that trip either. The one video I was able to put out on the last trip, which I put out from Oregon, on the hotel Wi-Fi, it took 7 hours to upload what I thought was a shortish video. I even changed the settings to make it smaller, but the hotel Wi-Fi was that bad. And then the place that I stayed up in the Canadian Rockies was had almost zero internet connection, which was good for the family. So we spent most of our time just enjoying just the astounding beauty of the Canadian Rockies. If you've never been there and you get a chance to go, by all means go. There was, I compared it to, let's say, Yosemite National Park and many of the national parks in the United States. One of the really refreshing things, even at Lake Louise, which was probably one of the busiest places, it wasn't anywhere near as busy as Yosemite or Glacier National Park or Yellowstone, some of the huge American national parks, which are also glorious, but I was just dumbfounded by the splendor and the beauty of the Canadian Rockies. It's truly just glorious. So after the family trip, I'll have a few weeks back. I'll get some videos in then, but I got to do some prep for the Europe trip, which will come after that. And after the Europe trip comes the Thunder Bay trip. So I'm going to try and make content on the Europe trip. Whether I can get the stuff posted, that's a whole nother thing, because once you make a file, it's one thing. Getting the file up to the internet and YouTube is another. So yeah, I warned you this summer was going to be spotty in terms of content. I want to do a little reflecting on Canada. This isn't the first time I've been to Canada. It was the first time that I've been to British Columbia and Alberta. And just especially given all of the strange changes in my life over the last 5 years through Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke, just a little bit more sensitive to just paying attention culturally to the differences between the United States and Canada. Now, again, being a member of the Christian Reformed Church, about 2/5 of the Christian Reformed Church is Canadian. I went to Calvin College and seminary with Canadians. I've got a brother-in-law who's a Canadian. So Canada, my grandfather served a church in Canada, the place he served for his longest time in Owen Sound, Ontario. I almost grew up in northern Alberta. In the Christian Reformed Church, it's kind of ministers are sort of free agents, and there was a church in northern Alberta, quite a ways north from then Edmonton, that my father was called to. And given the fact that my father spent 36 years in his first church, I could very well have grown up in northern Canada. But I did not. He married someone who was from the East Coast, and so he took a call to the East Coast, and as they say, the rest is history. So it's not that I'm unfamiliar with Canada or Canadians or some aspects of Canadian culture, but again, I'd never been to Canada in the West. I've been to Toronto a little bit. Our family visited Montreal when I was a child. So I just had a few thoughts and reflections on Canada as a result of this trip, especially given everything that had happened. Way more people than land, or excuse me, the other way around. Way more land than people. So I grew up in the East Coast, which had lots of people, very densely populated. I grew up just outside of New York City, so I was very used to people all around me all the time. And then when I moved to the West in the United States, to California, and I visiting national parks is one of my favorite things to do on vacation. And so I visited a lot of national parks in my 25 years living here in Sacramento, because we have just some beautiful national parks in the American West. And I've spent hours driving through the American West, and there are many places. I took my route back from the Canadian Rockies, took me through Kalispell and Idaho and Nevada and Oregon and California. And so there was a lot of desert that I drove through. But the amount of Canada, which is just doesn't have towns or people, or it was quite surprising to me, and beautiful, just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Really want to go back sometime, and looking forward to going back at some point to not just visit the sites, but also visit the people. Sherry from the Discord server, once a bunch of you Canadians heard I was coming your way, everyone's like, well, you're coming up to, and Sherry told me where she's from, and that was further north and west than we were going. And Andrea with the bang said, oh, you should stop by when you come through Calgary, and on and on and on. But it wasn't that kind of trip. But I do want to make one of those kinds of trips at some point, like we're doing in Europe. And so hopefully that will come at some point. A lot of immigrants. I was surprised at the number of immigrants and where the immigrants were sort of located. And often with immigration, you'll get immigrants working in the service industry. A lot of people from Pakistan and India, quite obviously, people from Southeast Asia. Had a wonderful chat with a young man when we went through Kamloops. A young man from South Africa who didn't like Kamloops at all, but was working as a waiter in the hotel that we stayed in there. It was strange to me, because one of the things that I have a fair bit more experience with some Canadians from the Christian Reformed Church. It was when I was in Canada, or actually it wasn't in Canada. I believe we were in Detroit. It was the first time that I had heard at a Christian Reformed meeting one of these land acknowledgments, and I remember the speaker, who was an employee of the denomination, a rather high-level employee, beginning his talk with a land acknowledgement, and I'd never heard anybody do that before, and I just paused and thought, and I thought, what is this? And I thought about the natural tension between a country that I could understand, if you're Canada, having an open immigration policy, because you've got slightly more land mass than the United States and less people than the state of California. And I would think, yeah, you'd want immigrants in your country to develop it and to populate it and to work it and to do all of those kinds of things. But with all these land acknowledgements, it's kind of like, well, why would you want to bring in more immigrants if you keep going on about talking about the fact that, this land belonged to someone else, and raising the questions about how the land was taken. So I always find that to be very strange. And I went to, when I was in Kamloops, they had a music in the park. Every night they had a music in the park. And it was very interesting sort of watching the people who gathered for the music in the park versus a lot of the immigrants who were working the service industry. And it just makes me wonder about how Canada functions culturally and multiculturally. And no criticism or even critique, just wonder, because what is Canada? What does it mean to be a Canadian? And those kind of questions just occurred to me as I just paid attention to the people I bumped into and tried to have little snippets of conversations with, and listen to some of their things. We rented. We helped the Canadian economy, I'll say that, in terms of the amount of money that we spent in Canada. But we rented canoes at one of these just beautiful lakes, and we had to sign this waiver going in, and my wife made a comment about what's in the waiver, and basically the woman says, it's about personal responsibility, and my wife made a joke about personal responsibility, and the woman just jumped right in and said, don't get me started on that, and kind of just tempted to drop Jordan Peterson's name right there, but I I withheld, and it was just a lot of little interesting interchanges, paying attention to different nuances, especially given the background of a lot of my experience with other Canadians in the Christian Reformed Church. I'll talk about that in the next slide when talk about a few other things. So it was interesting driving, drove down through Alberta and then across the I kept to the smaller border crossings because there's usually no line, and then into Montana. And again, Montana, which to me always seemed like a sparsely populated wilderness state compared to Alberta, was, absolutely teeming with people, and especially with churches. I saw very, very few churches in Canada. And if you drive on rural two-lane highways, which is what I prefer to do often if I don't have to make a lot of time, because on these little two-lane highways, you get a sense of the town and the people, and I just love culture and how it feels and where it goes. In the United States, you're just always passing by Bible churches and Baptist churches and Pentecostal churches and Lutheran churches and Reformed churches, and you're just passing by those. Didn't swing through Moscow, Idaho. That was on one of my possible routes, and I told my wife, if we go through Moscow, Idaho, I got to get a picture by the sign. But we did not, and there's just so many places I would love to visit. And I'd love to be on a Sunday and drop by Doug Wilson's church in Moscow and just get a sense of the place and get a sense of the people. And these kinds of things are just fun for me, but very few churches in Canada. There were some prominent churches. They seemed, probably United Church of Canada, sort of mainline-ish churches in Kamloops, and they had Aboriginal Lives Matter, things like that, of course, given the all of the controversy surrounding the boarding schools and all of that. But other than that, very, very few churches. Very interesting. Driving. Speed limits were quite low. I had to switch over the car 2 kilometers per hour. That wasn't wholly unused to that. I lived, of course, for a number of years in the Dominican Republic and put that on the bingo thing, and lived in kilometers per hour. And I think in the DR, I don't remember in the DR if they use Celsius or Fahrenheit, but I had to do all those conversions in my head, the Celsius Fahrenheit thing. But speed limits were low, and Canadian drivers obeyed them. And Canadian drivers you didn't have a lot of highway out there. There are very few roads, like I said, but people obeyed the speed limit and got great gas mileage because we were obeying the speed limit. And then it goes, you get back down into the United States, and the rule is, 5 or 10 over you can get away with. So if the speed limit's 65, you drive 75, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, got very annoyed by American drivers on the interstates that would stay in the left-hand lane. It's like, we need some more of those Canadian signs saying, hey, move over to the right, let people pass. So very, very good drivers in Canada. I was very impressed by that. And to me, it made the truckers' protest all the more interesting. Very, very law-abiding country, it seemed for the most part. So just, again, a few impressions. And all of that sort of on the background of Canadian politics. And, of course, even through, now through this channel, gaining even more Canadian friends. And I noticed just when I got back, Jordan dropping a piece on the sorry state of Canada. And it was just so interesting, the tensions that you could feel. I mean, I drove through Andrea's going to be mad at me, but I drove through Calgary. There's a lot of other people I know in Calgary too. So it's just, on a trip like this, I just dropped kids off at the airport and kept moving on. But Calgary is a boom town. I mean, the town is just absolutely exploding. You can see the major public works all over the place. And you see that in America. And then I spent the night in Boise. And, of course, Boise, another boom town in the United States. But, yeah, and talking to Canadians, real deep, a country that's deeply divided politically. And, you hear that with Jordan. And just one of the rural-urban divide, which I think has become one of the real fundamental divides. I think in the United States, the rural-urban divide is in some ways moderated by the fact that in the United States Senate, just by the way that the states came about in the United States. Rural America, I think, has a I would say probably how can I say it? Rural America has a voice partly because of the way the United States government is put together. Perhaps not in the same. Perhaps rural Canada doesn't have the same kind of voice that rural America has. I was thinking about the fact that the Canadian economy should just be booming. Canada has all of the stuff that the world needs now and will need: water, wood, oil, natural resources. Can grow food. Shorter growing season, I get that, but the just really amazed at the ranches and the farms, and talking to a number of Canadians, just that a lot of the green policies just squeezing it out. It almost seems like, I had a conversation with someone, it almost seems like urban Canada wants to turn the rest of the country into some giant national park. And, as far as the United States goes, that might work for the Americans too, because Canada will no longer be our hat, and in the future they'll just be our national park. But it doesn't do much. And, what Jordan was saying in this video, I didn't listen to the whole thing, but, about the poor, and he's dead on right. If you're going to bring in immigrants, those immigrants probably want opportunity, and they want to develop, and they want to do business, and they want to have families, and they want to put down roots and grow. If you're constantly squeezing, now obviously you want to do that responsibly when you've got such a beautiful, large land. You don't want to, have the kinds of environmental catastrophes that the United States has done over the years. But now that we know a little bit more about protecting the environment, you would think that there would be ways of doing that. But a lot of the Canadians that I talk to complain pretty heavily about the fact that they just seem to be squeezing the poor and squeezing the farmer and squeezing the rural voter. I noticed that Jordan just had I haven't listened to it yet, conversation with someone about the Dutch truckers protest, and so much Canadian news seems cornered and subsidized by the government that people don't hear about it. So yeah, it just seems terribly short-sighted for the urbanites, because all that food, all that electricity, all those really cool electrical gadgets that all the urbanites want, the stuff that powers your screen, where that all comes from? Comes from mines and logging and farms and rivers, and comes from all those places. So if I don't know, I'm not going to get into Canadian politics. It's not my place. It's not my country. But yeah, a lot of conversations hearing about these issues, and really makes me feel for it and worry for it, because Canada is, I think, a really special country, a really special place, and I want nothing but the best for them. But to the kinds of misery that silly policy making seems to be having. But I don't know. There's some of you who will feel free to correct me in the comment section. Go right ahead. I'm fine with that. Now, I got to keep this video short because it's late in the day, and I was working on my sermon, and because I got a sermon that really is due this Sunday. Sermons comes first, videos come second. So you get what's left over of my time. Sorry about that. Too many ideas. One of the things my wife and I like to do in these long road trips, which we very much enjoy, we like exploring new places, and we often listen to audiobooks. And a Canadian, in fact, recommended this book to me by Oliver Sacks, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and Other Clinical Tales. Really, we listened to the whole book on the trip and really enjoyed the book, and want to make some videos about a lot of the content of the book. And I can't speak to, James Frazee can speak to the up-to-dateness of the neurology in the book, but just had a lot of thoughts about all the things that we talk about in this channel. So hopefully weave some of that through. And I'm finishing up the trilogy on the Pacific War. That's sort of been my summer reading, and I'm tempted to dive into James Holland's first two books on the Second World War in Europe now that I've covered the Pacific War. I'm afraid that that will eat into a lot of the other reading due. But I've got a lot more travel and vacation to do, so I'll probably pick James Holland's books up too. Maybe I'm meeting Tom Holland in the UK when I go up there, having a really good event with Glenn Scrivener and someone else. So really looking forward to that. A lot of thinking about anger versus therapeutic niceness in this space. There's a lot of chatter on CRC Voices about Jordan Peterson's message to the churches. It really struck a nerve with a lot of people. And going to Canada, for all of the imagined posturing about lived experience, people still prioritize their ideologies over listening to the lived experience of other people when they're not obeying certain lines that they're expected to obey. Very interesting piece by David French that landed this past Sunday on Trump and Trump forming the Republican Party. And again, this really isn't a political podcast, but just prompted ideas about this. We have this culture where we sort of believe in niceness, and it's sort of anybody who's angry is not welcome. And that was sort of true of the left until really wokeness arose, and suddenly we have the angry woke left. And just a lot more thoughts about anger. It reminded me a bit of a book I had read a number of years ago, The Enigma of Anger, Garrett Kaiser. And I thought I should essays on a sometimes deadly sin, because anger is a very important thing. Anger itself is not a sin. The classic text in the Bible is, in your anger, do not sin. And the God of Israel and the God of the Bible is sometimes very angry. And so that's, there's a time and a place for anger, but when and where and why and how, I often, one of I think the best moments of wave one in Jordan Peterson was when he was on Bill Maher, and, there were a bunch of people from the sort of the progressive side of the American political spectrum, and they were kind of yucking it up about, dunking on Trump and beating up on him and such. And Jordan Peterson said, yeah, about half of your country voted for him. What are you going to do with them? And, I thought that was really a tremendous moment, because that's kind of the point when you're having a culture war. Okay, you're having a culture war. What are you going to do with your enemies? And that's when you get into, all of these really ugly, tyrannical stories of the 20th century. In this little corner, we've obviously revisited Stalin and communism and Nazism and some of those things. But what was going on in Imperial Japan is sort of a lesson too for, obviously Imperial Japan wasn't Christian, but it was highly traditional, or at least an attempt to regain traditionalism. And, so I learned these books didn't really focus too much on the rise of Japan in the modern world. It's something that really captures my curiosity, because it's a late arising, and it's an arising from, let's call it, a non-white area of the world, and the specific form that Imperial Japan took and what it led to in terms of how the army and the navy of Imperial Japan fought, and these battles on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and just amazing, and all not very long ago. And so been doing a lot of thinking about hard lines and soft lines and strategy and loving enemies, and really the question about how to influence and convert enemies, because and how the different voices, the strident antithetical voice, which has a place, and then the soft voice, and you find the God of the Bible using both. And it's been very interesting during the heyday of new atheism. They just couldn't believe this angry God of the Old Testament. But yet so many people trust in anger to try and do what exactly? So often in the book of Proverbs deals with that and notes both sides of it. And so wisdom is about knowing which voice to use, when and how, in order to what? In order to bless the world and love your enemies. And sometimes it requires a hard line, and sometimes it requires a soft word, and figuring out when and how to do that dance. So a lot of thoughts on that. But this video isn't the video for that. I wanted to, make some comments and just give a little update. I'm saying I'm still out there. It's kind of interesting. Hear the booming on Florin Road. It's kind of interesting looking at what not posting a video on your channel for over a week does to the analytics, and kind of fun to watch what videos sort of get picked up and watched, and just watching the life of the Google Analytics, the YouTube Analytics. So just to say a word that I've not given up on my video project. I found this to be a good thing to do, a good way to think out loud, and it's actually kind of frustrating when I'm on a vacation like this. I don't have time or opportunity or often internet bandwidth to think out loud, but then I'll think out loud with my wife or my kids, or just think all by myself in my noggin, which is not nearly as enjoyable or productive. So I just wanted to do this little video and give you a little something, and there'll be a rough draft for Sunday this week because I do have to do a sermon. Might be a video for Monday if I can find time tomorrow to do so. But again, the few days back, we'll see. Now the next trip, I'll be doing some driving, but it's going to be much more air travel, and yeah, I don't know what it'll be. So yeah, I'm alive and well. Things are good. Just showing you my schedule. So sorry, Kale. You'll have to listen to something else while you run. So, yep. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment.